If you were branded a rightist, your family became what was called a black family. So within society, you were known to be a family that people weren't supposed to talk to. You were ostracized.
For the next 20 years, he couldn't write anything. It's not allowed to use his name to write. He was punished to doing the hard labor. To clean the public toilet, 13 of them, and which considered the most insulting and unbearable work. We lived underground, real underground. We dig a hole on the ground and we live in there. Of course, we have to make bricks ourselves, to dig the earth, to make the mold and make our bricks and fire it and take it out. So I know all the process, and I build my own bookshelves and my own bed. So you start to learn everything from very early age.
Ai Weiwei, I think, found refuge in some sense with his hands. I mean, he became almost obsessively interested in crafting things. He would make all kinds of homemade inventions.
Of course, when we grew up, it's not a fashion to talk about art or literature. And he burned all his books because the right guard would come anytime to check on those books. So you better burn it, otherwise constantly trouble you're in.
The government controlled everything, and the art was part of that. Many of the artists were put in what they called cowsheds, which was a kind of prison, and they were given animal names. They were called snakes and mules. Students used to take off their belts and whip them. And they stood in an airplane position, which is like this, for hours on end. So artists could only function as propaganda painters. Only approved subjects and approved styles. For 30 years, really, that was the art scene.
It's interesting, this motif, which was so popular, which is this motif of the sunflower. First of all, the idea of sunflowers that always turn to the sun became a ready metaphor for all of the people turning to look at Mao. So you have that kind of idea of obedience, inevitable obedience, because the sunflower doesn't choose.
In 1976, Mao Zedong died. He'd led the country for over 30 years and become one of the most influential and controversial figures in political history. Despite the cult of personality that had been fostered around him, after his death, many of his policies were abandoned as China embraced economic reform. The same year, Ai Qing was allowed to return to Beijing. It was a turning point for Ai Weiwei too.
By this time, your father's reputation had been rehabilitated. So what did your father say when you said you wanted to go to the United States?
He has been in many, many nations. He studied in Paris. But in his generation, when they decide to go out, the purpose is to use their knowledge to change China. So I told him that's his generation, and I don't care. I just have to leave. So I was quite extreme. I made a decision would never come back to China again. So I told my mother on the way to airport, I said, I'm going home.
Home for Ai Weiwei was New York.
First thing I want to experience is liberty. This is a really extremely liberal world. very much want to record it. I have nothing else to do. I just, it's very simple. Have a camera and take a shot. Thompson Square Park probably was the most liberal park in New York City. It's surrounded by musicians, poets, artists, poor people, homeless.
A riot took place here in 1988 after the city authorities imposed a curfew on the park. Ai Weiwei found himself in the middle of it.
Just give us the park, and we'll talk.
To see a civil movement against local government or police brutality is very fascinating.
He lived on the Lower East Side, which at that time was really a down-and-out place. I went up in the elevator to his apartment, and it was just one room, a mattress on the floor, and the only other possession was a TV. And it was during the Senate investigation, I think it was the Iran-Contra hearings. He was so excited that the government would actually go after their own.
And you've admitted that you lied to the Congress, is that correct?
I have.
And you've admitted that you lied in creating false crimes?
I start to realize there's many things I don't really understand. I should leave some image about it, so later on, maybe it can serve some purpose.
There was a very active Chinese exile community in New York, which he also documented. He had a lot of connections and dialogues with a Chinese diaspora, Chinese artists, composers, architects. And went, for example, to meet Allen Ginsberg. He met the poets of the Beat generation. And for him, the poetry link was vital.
Increasingly exposed to Western influences, Ai Weiwei visited museums and galleries, acquainting himself with a more conceptual approach to contemporary art, taking particular inspiration from Andy Warhol and Marcel Duchamp.
Don't make too much art, use what's already out there, but you as an artist, you can say this is art. Marcel Duchamp, very simple. And Marcel Duchamp also tries to question the context of art and when something gets to be art. When is art? Not what is art, but when is art.
I guess the important thing were these great influences that he discovered and had. Some things were direct homages, a coat hanger bent into the shape of the profile of Duchamp. A double-ended shoe, as if the left and the right shoe had somehow morphed into one. It's the artwork as a kind of small, mysterious, enigmatic object. But in a way, the fact that everything was grounded in the everyday, in stuff that you could find on the street or in your wardrobe, gave him a great deal of freedom.
He's always liking to taking things apart, putting them back, but always with meticulous refinement, so they were beautiful objects. So Weiwei, when he does something, he does it really, really well.
If I look at those photos, I can see a young man who is struggling and trying to adjust himself to a new environment. It's a lot of struggle and also a lot of uncertainty there.
By 1989, uncertainty was also brewing in China. In April, following the death of a pro-democracy official, groups gathered in Tiananmen Square calling for political reform.
It's like a people's revolution, and it seems everything's going to change. Everybody's so enthusiastic about it.
They had such optimism. All these young people, they wanted to be represented. They wanted a voice.
My father was on wheelchair. He personally went to the square to support the students. He said, whoever lost the way of the people would have lost their governing. And he showed strong support for the student.
Then, in early June, the army moved into the streets of Beijing with troops and tanks, clearing the protesters with live fire. The exact number of deaths is not known, but is thought to be in the thousands.
Nobody believed this government can use tank. The impossible.
You went back to China because to see your father. Mm-hmm. Did that draw you back to China and keep you there?
At the very beginning, when I heard my father is ill, after the Tiananmen, and I started to realize some sort of a responsibility.
I think there was a certain point for him, particularly around Tiananmen Square, where you had this sort of deep freeze in the Chinese art world and in Chinese commercial life. And then afterwards you had this reawakening. And I think at that point he started to realize that something was happening in China. He had to participate in it.
Ai Weiwei soon began work on a series of underground books.
We call it black book, white book, and a gray book. The book has no title because this underground printing, that means it's not legal.
那么，所以开始从93年就酝酿要做一本这种书。所以90年代初呢，整个的这个文化艺术界是一个特别沉寂的这么一个状态。国外的这种前卫艺术大师的一些作品和他们的一些，这个书是等于是，如果说的就是不太好听的话，叫非法出版物。完了呢，找深圳的一家香港公司做的这个排版和印刷。
Yes, this is my photography. That's about in front of Tiananmen Square. It was very dangerous, actually, with kind of nudity. People are not ready to accept.
但是当时他们名不见经传，就是但是都是就是那种创作的欲望。
It became a sensation, not only for foreigners who were interested in the Chinese art world, but really for Chinese artists themselves. I think it was one of the first times in that period where they started to realize that something was germinating. They became, in some sense, kind of iconic documents of that period, and they still are today.
I planted it because in the early time, we see my father really likes this kind of objects. He would touch it till it become very red. Yes, it's very, very unique.
Ai Weiwei's father died in 1996. By that time, he'd resumed his role as a distinguished literary figure and one of China's greatest modern poets, embraced by the establishment. His last words to his son were a plea for him to make his home in China.